Hi, I'm Nancy Gross, and I'm here with my colleague Jesse Hawkins, and we're also here with Professor Benjamin Haupert, who just gave a great talk on his new book, Instrument of the State. And we just wanted to follow up your formal talk with a conversation a little bit about more about you and how you got interested in your topic, and various questions about your research.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So with that, how did you get you've been interested in prisons and art in institutions for quite some time. Can you talk a little bit about how you started?
Yeah, I mean, aside from what I mentioned in the talk of discovering that record in my parents' record collection, I think all of us as Americans kind of run into these images of prison, these poetic images of prison. So, like, I don't feel I'm that uncommon from somebody who was struck by that moment in Shawshank Redemption when Andy Dufresne takes over the PA speaker to play Mozart, which is a Marriage of Figaro or something. And so I think we all live with this fascination to different degrees about this combination between prison and music. But for me, it became interesting for the same reasons I talk about it in the book, is that I was simultaneously learning about these songs and American folklore's debt to prison and the musicians who recorded these albums and the people who collected them. And then just reading like a Harper's article about, like, you know, the crisis of medical care in prisons, or the way AT&T was monetizing and monopolizing communication between prisoners and families and stuff. So it was, in the 90s, it was a moment where mass incarceration was just so big and concerning, and I think especially white folks were starting to wake up to mass incarceration as a social justice issue, rather than just desserts for a reasonable response to crime or something, or preventative tactic. So when I first took action on it was when I was a graduate student at UCLA. And at this point, I started graduate school at age 30, and I had done I had studied music at Wesleyan University, which had a very big world music program, and you know, I played in different groups and interacted with different people. I took time off to go study Indian music in the Bay Area. I had traveled to Istanbul to do research for my anthropology thesis on Sufi music there. I got a Watson Fellowship after graduating there, and went to India and Egypt and Spain and did work there. So by the time I started graduate school, I was a little sick of traveling. And so as we were going over projects for the MA thesis, I was between a few different ones, but it was just prison was on my mind because it was such an issue that I was concerned about, and the proximity of music to it was something that I knew from just stumbling around as an American and musician. So, you know, I'm not trying to say that like I took the easy way out, because it probably would have been easier if I would have done work in like Mozambique just to get a visa and take a plane ride over there. It was no easy task to get into California prisons when I started doing that research.
And can you talk a little bit more about how you actually did find your way into prisons? You know, how did you get that permission, and did you come with endorsements, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, it's funny, and I think each prison had a different, or each prison system had a different route in. I say to people a lot, like, it's really hard for some of us to get into prison. It's very easier for others to get sent. And the running joke in grad school was, well, you could get state funding if you just knock over a liquor store and you get sent to prison for a while, do your research there. But at first I tried to use every single connection that I had, and I knew I knew a few people who were involved in representing people who were incarcerated, sort of activist lawyers. I went through them. I went through a guy, I had a connection to a guy who had done the film The Farm, blanking on his name right now. And so he had done a documentary at Angola for that one. But the California stuff, I had a lot of connections because I was 30 and I had people who were, I wasn't just fresh from college. I had people who could get me in. And I kept getting roadblocks in there. And so finally I just called up like the main number for the Department of Corrections in California. And I kind of explained that I wanted to do a research project there on music or something. And I started getting transferred around the department. And finally I ended up in the phone rang in somebody's office who had been running the Arts and Correction program, which was, I would later learn, was a program that had started in the mid-70s and was the largest American investment in the arts.
Wow.
Public investment in the arts, because it had run so long. And at this point, in 2003, it was getting shut down. And budget cuts is one, but the other is they had lost the people who were protecting them above the wardens. And so I just happened to call at the right time where this woman who was running the program, Gail Gutierrez McDermott, was furious. And she was clearing out her office. You know, all of the work that she had done to support the arts, I mean, you can imagine, was going down the tubes. And here's this graduate student who calls up, says, I want to learn about the art and music in prison. So she emailed me spreadsheets of anybody who had taught music or art in California prisons over like a decade or more since she had been organizing the thing. And then I had all these people's phone numbers who are also losing their jobs or getting sort of subsumed under the education department or the recreation department, losing their budgets, losing their spaces and stuff. So I came in at this moment where I kind of rode the wave of the disinvestment in the arts in order to get in. And at that time I was very much under the spell of Lomax, and like to me that was a stepping stone to get into like the real prison music, the people who, you know, I could see myself writing that letter that Lomax wrote where he was like, I'm looking for made up songs, passed up, illiterate like musicians and stuff. But I think after doing work and meeting musicians through there, I also became fascinated with the way that musicians work with the administration, work within programs, and kind of are part of a much more complex thing than just like a barrier to the outside world, but they're really enmeshed in this. And so the terms of my access weren't just instrumental, they became a major way that I thought about not only my relationship with the music and the musicians and the administration, but also the musicians' relationship to that too. So that was California. When I went to Angola, I wrote to 3 places that the Lomax had visited before. So I wrote to, I don't know why I didn't write Florida. I guess I just wasn't interested in those recordings. But I wrote to Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Texas didn't respond to my query.
Okay.
I called them a few times and wrote emails. Louisiana, or Mississippi said I could come, but I wouldn't be allowed to interview any of the prisoners there. Which, if you're an ethnomusicologist or learning how to be an ethnomusicologist, that was, that's a barrier. I probably could have pushed it more, but I was, I'll do the short version of the story. I was at a grade school reunion, which the only reason we had them is because I grew up in Saudi Arabia and everybody was interested in discovering each other's. And I ran into somebody who had sat in front of me in like history class in the 6th grade, Paige Perilou. And Paige's godmother was the acting warden of the women's prison. And so here was a connection. Yeah, the women's prison in Louisiana, which is just south of Baton Rouge. And the women moved from Angola in 1961, so they had been at this in St. Gabriel. And so she said, I'd be happy to set something up. So I started with emailing her, and I sent her a copy of the film, a short film I had done at the California prison, which then proved to the administration, or allowed her to make a case to the administration in Louisiana that I was serious about what I did. And that I produced things and I'm legit. And so that opened the door to the women's prison, which I looked at as a stepping stone to get to Angola. Of course, after I do these perfunctory interviews with the women who are in the choir there, and this is before Orange is the New Black, so we weren't really thinking about women incarcerated then. They said to me, I'm so glad you came here. Nobody pays attention to us. And as I walked out of there, I was like, okay, I have to come back. And so I ended up doing work with the women's prison and the second largest men's prison there too. And which was good. I mean, not just like I feel better because I paid attention to what, 6-7% of the incarcerated population is women. But I also got a perspective on gender. I got a perspective of different institutions, how they have different cultures, different procedures, different architecture. So I think that we ought to really pay attention to access, not only as a means to get to where we're going, but as a way of looking for opportunities of things we might miss, of just like the messiness and happenstance of that can be a really great thing if we open up ourselves to that. Otherwise, I never would have spent time with the women there. I never would have done a collaborative essay with Consuela Gaines, who had gotten out there, and we wrote a piece together and have done collaborative work. So, yeah, so it's not a short story when you're talking about access.
And what year did you start working in Louisiana?
Louisiana was 2008. That's when my first trip there was in 2008.
Angola?
That same year.
Same year. And not that we're looking for compliments, but did you use our archives or other archives? Because some work has been done in Angola. Do you want to just say how that influenced your take?
Yeah, it was, Todd Harvey was running the Lomax archive then.
That's right.
And so I came in, I spent one really intensive summer coming with a reader's card into the Folklife Center. I visited Smithsonian Folkways as well, but didn't find it as organized, and they didn't have as much stuff. No slight on Jeff Place. He's a wonderful guy, and I loved that collection, and it was really great to go there.
Sure.
But the collection here, there was, like, to be able to look over like the original recordings and see layers of documentation, layers of notes that John Lomax took on these recordings, or Alan, to be able to read correspondence that between Harry Oster trying to get funding to buy reels of tape to record in there, was to read the correspondence and even the newsletters published of like criticisms of Lomax. It was just like to have access to that documentation was really important, because it just made it more real. It just made the material more real when I could listen to the minute that the recorder went down, when the needle went down to start recording, to the song, to afterwards, and to hear those voices. It didn't feel as much like a compilation, like the compilation CD that I have of like Lead Belly recordings.
Right.
There's a grain to those that made it feel really real. So I used some of it in the first chapter of the book. I don't go into it. There are other people who've used the archive more fully, but just to have a comparison and to be able to write what I do in the first chapter, of kind of putting all that in the context of the history of the prison. Without that documentation, there just isn't a whole lot of stuff. There's some passing comments in newspapers about the jazz band, some documentation on like the chaplain who was at Angola during that time and a little before. And so it was really useful stuff. And even though they were just there for 2 trips, in 1933 and 1934, in the first trip the machine's broken. Anyway, so it's incredible what they were able to produce and how important that was. I mean, I wish they would have gone back every year before, just to be able to see some of these things. And so, you know, you can criticize the stuff that they're leaving out context, or they're not interviewing people and things like that, but you know, I was able to see much more like what their project was, and how a lot of things that people criticized them for were outside of the scope of what they were trying to do. So I think having access to this stuff wasn't just important for the data, but just to understand like how we study music in prisons. Yeah.
And so your work, your recordings, and your writing, as well as your 2 films, are joining the archive of the American Folklife Center. And so I'm wondering, you know, now your archival neighbors will be John and Alan Lomax, Bruce Jackson, Harry Oster, and I'm wondering how you think about the way people will use your archival collection in 10, 20, 100 years.
Hearing you say that, it's a little surreal because I'm just like, those are such amazing and important collections. You know, it gives access to the thing that I'd wanted to do all along, which is to do a much longer history of music at an institution like this, and to see if prison changes, it certainly changes the music somehow. And that was like the impetus for the book. So this puts it at other people's fingertips to be able to draw other conclusions, tell other kinds of stories, and things like that. And I'm excited for that. I did an archival project on California arts, all the stuff I was mentioning earlier when the arts programs were getting shut down. I got money from the Grammy Foundation and from Chris Waterman, the then dean of the School for Arts and Architecture, to collect all that stuff and archive it at UCLA. And that was such a good experience because I understood, working with archivists, that you collect these things so that like hundreds of stories can come out of the material. And so I approached that with the idea of openness and the idea of like trying to organize it and collect the right things, but not necessarily tell a story for it. So I'm just like, we all want our work to live on in certain ways, but we want it to live on through other people. So, but I'll say the one thing that I feel good about is that though the context, the political system, the economies, all the things that I trace out of my research isn't represented in their stuff, I'm glad to bring an updated like ethnomusicological perspective to the area, which, you know, in this moment is much more aligned to like new materialism or ecosystem approaches, music ecosystem approaches. And so it feels good to update it, not just with material, but with new ways of thinking about why music matters and why we document these things.
Well, so you made 2 films about California and Louisiana prisons. You've written your book, Instrument of the State, and then also done audio recordings. So I was curious how you chose each medium for these different stages of your projects.
Oh, you're asking all these questions that could go on for hours or something like that. Some of it was strategy.
Yeah.
The film work, I mean, I was in LA and there were in grad school, and there were a lot of my friends from college who were in the industry there, who were, you know, either writing for TV shows or production companies or doing different things. So I was always at parties where people were talking about audiovisual stuff in that way. And so it didn't feel that scary. But part of it was when I called up Gail and talked to her, and I started then following her leads to all of these arts facilitators that were there. I was able to go as a visitor into the prisons and meet musicians who were there. And there's a guy, Jack Bowers, who's still very much an activist, and we have some of his stuff in the collection. Jack had taught jazz at Soledad Prison. The prison where, like, I think the first Black Panther party in prison had started. George Jackson was there. It was like sort of, it's a storied place in the beginning of prisoner rights movement. And Jack had taught there for 35 years or something, a long time. And so I would go in and I'd spend the day there. and I wasn't able to take notes because I couldn't look like I was doing research. You see, they had shut down also the research department, or at least fired or changed the people who were supposed to sign the documents to allow me to do research. So the blanks, the lines for people to sign still were there, but the people weren't there to sign them. So I couldn't get in. It was like Kafka. It was like a Kafka novel. And, or maybe you'd say like, it's like prison, or like a major bureaucracy. And so what I would do is I'd go in for days. And Tony Seeger, who I worked with at UCLA, said, well, this is really good for you. You go in and observe and then take notes afterwards. And I'd go like to the nearest restaurant, order a hamburger, and just like take notes on my yellow pad for like 2 hours. And that's how I was doing my research. And so then I did an offsite interview with Jack at like a coffee shop once, and I'd gotten a camera and I was doing a video interview. And I said to him, we had just seen a dozen bands play within like an hour or hour and a half there, which was incredible because playing in bands, like there's all this time in between sets where people are waiting around. Not these guys. These guys were just like, you know, it was such a different thing. I saw this guy do this like rap where he was censoring out all the language so he wouldn't get written up, which created this like really halting rhythm, like incidental rhythm to it. I mean, there were just things that I wanted to write about that I wanted to document. And I finished the interview with Jack. I put down the camera and I say, this would make such a great documentary film. And Jack looks at me and he says, this is California. He said, they just shot a Metallica video up at San Quentin. Like, I can get you in as a documentarian in a month. And so I was like, okay, I'm a documentarian. Well, it was also good that I was at UCLA because then I could study with people. And so I ended up taking a documentary film class with Marina Goldovskaya, the late Marina Goldovskaya, who was a Russian documentarian in the 80s and did a lot of amazing documentaries on like sort of life after the fall of the wall. And she appreciated having somebody from ethnomusicology in there, somebody who just wasn't, I mean, all of those students were so smart and I learned so much from them about like, just the rhetoric of cinematography, of the importance of pans. And so I took it seriously. I really learned a lot. And the other aspect of my research has been on audiovisual ethnomusicology. So it stuck with me. But then I was able to do that first film in there using that. And working in that medium was really interesting because it forced me to write differently. And I think in this book I'm more narrative. I'm trying to paint the details of, like in the aspect of like writing about the heel slashing, of like really trying to set the stage and really trying to show that life, but also thinking about editing. When is it Roman Croater from the Canadian filmmaker said every cut in film is a lie. So lie well and lie truthfully. And so like also thinking of editing and ellipsis and working with other people's words and things like that and the ethics of documentary filmmaking is something that I gained through that. So, and then audio recording, I didn't do a whole lot of it. I actually became less interested in just audio recording other than for interviews because seeing the images of people singing and making music and collaborating and living their lives in the institution is such an important part. You know, Tony Seeger once said, it's a shame that audio recording was invented before the video camera. And maybe if it hadn't been, we wouldn't have separated dance and music. We wouldn't have separated the physical and the oral in that way. And I see that in here. I think I've listened to the recordings for my film just on their own, and they're different. They don't have, we listen to them differently.
Can we ask what you're going to work on next? Or are you going to continue with prisons, or what's next for you?
Yeah, I've been doing some work. So I've helped launch and have supported as much as I can our Georgetown's Prison Scholars Program that we run down at the DC jail and now up at Jessup. And so out of there, I met a lot of guys who were, well, men and women were in the classes. And I ended up shifting more to sound studies. I became less interested in expression and much more interested in sound and how people listen when they're indoors all the time and dealing with acoustics that are much worse. They don't have nice rugs like this on the floor, so it's a real challenge. And so I've been working with them, with two guys who got out on the Second Chance Act. And so they were there, they had done 20-some years, but were convicted as juveniles, so they got retried and got out. They're incredible people. One was commissioner, what's the local level of commissioner in DC? The neighborhood,
Yeah.
it's that neighborhood level of commissioner. I forget the name.
ANC.
ANC
thank
commissioner,
you.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. ANC commissioner, and was elected ANC commissioner while he was in the jail still.
Wow.
So these are incredible, incredible, smart people. And they were students in my sound class, in my music in prison seminar that I'd done in there before. And they got out, and we've kept up our work together. So we have a co-authored piece in a edited volume on sound and incarceration with a group of international scholars that I'm excited. They want to do a theatrical thing. And I'm really nervous about it, but I'm sort of committed to other people being in the driver's seat, because I've been in the driver's seat for a long time. And I figure if I've put people on camera before and, put spotlight on folks and drawn attention, then I deserve, if they want to be in a play, I'm be in a play, we'll do it. So I don't know. I mean, they're really amazing. I'll call them scholars now. I think we're all scholars together. And so I hope that work will continue. But right now I'm finishing up, handing over the archive, I'm finishing up just tiny old projects that I've always pushed to the side while trying to get this massive project done. So, they're just random things that aren't as burdensome as that. I'm trying to turn my first final paper from grad school into a published article
Oh, great.
about late 19th century zither technology. More as an experiment, just to see my first academic writing can be like appropriate now. So it's things like that. I have a failed project I had done with the guitarist Mark Rebo about labor organizing for musicians outside of the union that we weren't able to finish, and we're still friendly, we still get along, but it sort of ended with us butting heads over like an academic approach versus an activist approach. And so I brought that back to try to rekindle that and think about intersections between that. But right now I'm really interested in music policy. And I think it grows from seeing how important all the sub-institutions within the prison were for music making. The inmate lending fund for financing things, inmate council for gaining little bits of power in there, all these different clubs to be able to sponsor musicians for banquets and things like that, even just people in the administration. And so seeing that perspective and having so many of my friends who are professional musicians who really have a rough time if they've stayed in it, of like trying to live in this like crazy marketplace that is like what people call the music industry or something. Like I'm trying to direct a lot of my efforts towards building up programs and scholarship that's on not just like equitable music industry jobs, but trying to think together about sort of like Chipper's work on sustainability and music ecosystems. How can we make music sustainable?
Well, we'll look forward to hearing more about that in the
Yeah.
future. For right now, I think we just want to thank you for coming and giving a great Botkin lecture. And we're delighted that your research is now archive neighbors with all our other holdings on Angola and on prison music. Thank you so much for coming.
It's quite an honor, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben.